The axe fell with a grunt, splitting the seasoned pine in a clean, satisfying crack. Clara wiped a stray strand of sweat-damp hair from her brow with the back of a calloused hand, her breath misting in the sharp Wyoming air. The pile of firewood was growing, a bulwark against the coming winter and a testament to the rhythm of her days. Chop, stack, haul, mend the fence, check the snares, clean the rifle. These were the rituals that kept the ghosts at bay, the steady drumbeat of survival that drowned out the whispers from town. She was 28, though the lines around her eyes and the hard set of her mouth told a story of a woman twice that age. The folks down in Dusty Redemption, a good half-day's ride away, had a name for her: the Cursed Bride. They'd spit the words out like sour milk, the women pulling their children a little closer when she rode in for salt and flour, the men looking at her with a mix of pity and scorn. She knew what they said in the saloon, their voices thick with whiskey and judgment, bought and paid for, then left to rot. A mail-order bride for a man who took one look at the half-burned cabin he'd inherited and the woman who came with it, and rode on without a word, leaving her standing in the dust of his departure. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know the cold dread that had seeped into her bones when she'd first seen the blackened timbers of her new home, or the suffocating silence of the man who was meant to be her husband. He hadn't just abandoned her, he had unmade her, stripping away the fragile hope she had carried all the way from Missouri. What he left behind was this creature of hard labor and harder silence. A woman who had learned that the only thing you could truly count on was the ache in your own muscles at the end of the day. Her land was a harsh patch of earth, clawed from the unforgiving hills. The cabin, scarred by a fire from years before her arrival, stood against the wind like a stubborn old tooth. It was her fortress and her prison, the place where she was safe from judging eyes and the place where her loneliness was a physical presence, as real and as cold as the iron stove in the corner. When the last of the logs was split and stacked, she leaned the axe against the woodpile and walked around the back of the cabin. Here, sheltered from the ceaseless wind by the stoop of a weeping willow, was the one place on this earth that held any softness for her. A small mound of earth, marked by a smooth river stone she had carried up from the creek. There were no words carved into it, no name to be weathered by the seasons. The name was carved into her heart, a wound that would never heal. Rose. Clara knelt, her rough wool trousers digging into the cold ground. She pulled a small, faded blue ribbon from her pocket, its silkiness a strange contrast to her work-roughened fingers, and laid it gently on the stone. "The sky's looking heavy, little one," she whispered, her voice a low, unused thing. "Feels like the first big snow is on its way. I got plenty of wood in, though. We'll be warm." She talked to the grave as if the child beneath it could hear, telling her of the deer she'd spotted that morning, of the leak in the roof she'd finally patched. It was a foolishness. She knew, but it was hers. Here, in the quiet company of the daughter she'd borne in shame and lost to fever. She was not the cursed bride. She was just a mother. The child was the secret she guarded more fiercely than her own life. The reason a man's touch felt like fire and a soft word felt like a lie. She was the product of a brutal night long before the promise of a new life in Wyoming. A memory of violence that had stolen her girlhood and left her with a child the world would have condemned. Losing her had been a second, deeper tearing of her soul. A sharp gust of wind rattled the willow's bare branches, and Clara looked up. The sky to the west was the color of a fresh bruise, a dark, churning purple that was swallowing the pale blue of the afternoon. The air had gone still and heavy, carrying the scent of imminent snow. The storm was coming faster than she'd thought. She stood, tucking the ribbon back into her pocket, and gave the stone one last, lingering touch. "Stay warm," she murmured, a prayer to the dirt. She turned back toward the cabin, her eyes scanning the property, a habit born of solitude. And then she saw it, a dark shape crumpled near the woodpile, a shape that did not belong. It was a man. He was face down in the dirt and the gathering twilight, a heap of worn leather and denim that looked as if it had been dropped from the sky. Clara's hand went instantly to the pistol holstered at her hip. Her heart hammered a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one ever came out this far. Trappers and prospectors kept to the known trails, and the folks from town wouldn't dare. Her land was considered tainted, unlucky. She approached with the slow, deliberate steps of a hunter, her pistol drawn and steady. The wind was picking up now, whipping her hair across her face and carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. He didn't move. As she got closer, she saw the dark, ugly stain soaking the back of his coat and spreading onto the frosty ground beneath him. Blood. With the toe of her boot, she nudged his shoulder. A low groan escaped him, a sound of pure misery. He was alive. Then, just barely, she holstered her pistol, her mind racing. She could leave him, let the storm take him. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. A wounded man was trouble, and trouble was something she had spent the last 3 years avoiding at all costs. He could be a thief, an outlaw, a man running from something that would surely follow. But as the snow began to fall in earnest, a thick, swirling curtain that was already blurring the edges of the world, she looked at his still form and saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own desperate solitude. Leaving him to die felt like a cruelty she could not afford. It would be one more ghost to haunt this already haunted piece of land. With a curse that was lost to the wind, she bent down. "All right, you fool," she muttered to the unconscious man. "Looks like your bad luck just ran into mine." Getting him inside was a brutal, straining affair. He was a big man, all dead weight and limp limbs. She hooked her arms under his, digging her heels into the slick ground and pulling, dragging him backward one agonizing step at a time. His head lolled, and the smell of sweat, blood, and the cold outdoors filled her senses. The blizzard descended in its full fury, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, the snow so thick she could barely see the cabin door a few feet in front of her. By the time she got him over the threshold and kicked the door shut against the storm, she was gasping for breath, her muscles screaming in protest. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. There was only the roar of the wind outside and the sound of her own ragged breathing. The man lay in a heap on the floorboards, a dark, wet stain already seeping into the wood. Clara didn't waste a moment. She stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows across the one-room cabin. Then she turned her attention to him. She worked with an angry, detached efficiency, her movements jerky and devoid of any tenderness. This was not an act of mercy. It was a chore, a problem to be dealt with. She grabbed a knife and sliced through the laces of his worn leather coat, peeling the frozen, blood-caked garment off him. Underneath, his flannel shirt was plastered to his skin, the fabric dark and stiff with dried and fresh blood. She had to cut that off him too, the blade snagging on the rough cloth. His skin was frighteningly cold to the touch, and a violent shiver racked his body. The wound was high on his left shoulder, a nasty, ragged hole where a bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. It was oozing sluggishly. She gritted her teeth. She had patched up her own hurts, stitched a deep gash in her leg from a fall. But this was different. This was filth and danger, brought right into her home. She fetched a basin of water and a bottle of whiskey, the good stuff she kept for the worst of the winter nights. Tearing a strip from a clean flour sack, she poured the whiskey over the wound. The man arched off the floor with a strangled cry, his body convulsing, his eyes flying open. They were dark eyes, clouded with pain and confusion, and they fixed on her with a wild, animal panic. He tried to push her away, his hand fumbling weakly at her arm. "Don't!" he rasped, his voice a dry, cracked thing. "Don't touch me." Something inside Clara snapped. All the bitterness, all the lonely years, all the resentment at this intrusion boiled over. She slapped his hand away, her face a mask of cold fury. She leaned in close, her own eyes blazing with a desperate fire he could see even through his haze of pain. "You listen to me," she hissed, her voice low and trembling with intensity. "You got two choices. You can die out there in that snow, and I'll bury what's left of you come spring. Or you can lie here. Let me fix you. And you owe me. You owe me something in here." He stared at her, his breathing shallow and labored. He saw past her anger, past the harsh lines of her face. He saw the sheer, bone-deep desperation in her eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a cornered thing, of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The fight in her seemed to reach out and steady the fading fight in him. The world outside was a howling vortex of white death. The world in here was a cabin with a fire and a woman with eyes like hot coals. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he gave a slight nod. The fight went out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the pain and the fire in his shoulder. "All right," he breathed, the words barely audible. "But no talking." Clara gave a short, sharp nod of her own. Silence. She could work with silence. Silence was her oldest friend. "Fine," she clipped out. She went back to cleaning the wound, her hands still rough, still angry, but now with a grim purpose. She packed it with a poultice of yarrow to stop the bleeding and bound it tightly with more clean strips of cloth. She covered him with a heavy wool blanket and left him on the floor by the hearth, then went about her own evening chores as if nothing had happened, her movements precise and automatic. He drifted in and out of consciousness for the rest of the night and all through the next day. The blizzard raged, sealing them in, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white noise and swirling snow. Clara moved around him, stepping over his still form as she went from the water barrel to the stove. She forced sips of broth between his lips when he was lucid, ignoring his weak protests. She kept the fire roaring, the warmth a fragile shield against the Arctic cold that seeped through the chinks in the log walls. On the third morning, the wind finally died down, leaving an eerie, muffled silence. The man was awake, propped up on one elbow, his dark eyes clear and watchful. He had the gaunt, hollowed-out look of a man who had been to the edge of death and back. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, covered in a dark stubble, and a long scar cut a white line through his left eyebrow. He looked dangerous, even lying wounded on her floor. Clara was sitting at the small wooden table, cleaning her rifle, the metallic clicks of her work the only sound in the room. She didn't look at him, but she felt his gaze on her. "You're on my land," she said, her voice flat. "You're in my house. You're breathing my air. That comes at a price." He said nothing, just watched her with that unnerving stillness. She finished with the rifle and set it aside, finally turning to face him directly. Her expression was hard, unyielding. "The storm's passed, but you're not healed. You're staying here until that shoulder is mended enough for you to be useful. You will earn your keep." She stood up and began to pace the small space, her boots thudding on the floorboards. "Rule 1, you chop the wood. I'll show you where. You keep that wood box full. Rule 2, you haul the water from the creek. The buckets are by the door. Don't spill any. Rule 3, there's a leak in the roof over my cot. You'll fix it when you're strong enough to climb. Rule 4, you do not ask me questions. You do not talk about where you came from, and you do not ask about me. We live here in silence." She stopped in front of him, looming over him where he lay. "You eat my food. You sleep by my fire. In return, you work when I decide you're healed enough to survive out there. You leave. You understand?" He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. Then he gave another one of those slow, deliberate nods. "I understand," he said, his voice stronger now, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. "Good," she said, turning away. The deal was struck. That night, they ate in their established silence, Clara ladled a thick rabbit stew into 2 bowls and set one on the floor beside him. She took her own bowl to her chair by the fire, on the opposite side of the hearth. The blizzard had passed, but the world outside was buried deep in snow, the cold more profound than ever. Inside, the fire crackled and spat, its light dancing on the rough-hewn walls. She ate slowly, methodically, but she was aware of his every move, the scrape of his spoon against the bowl, the quiet sound of his breathing. She found herself watching him from across the flickering space that separated them. She watched the way the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, the way his broad shoulders slumped with weariness, the careful way he moved to favor his wounded side. There was a coiled tension in him, a sense of a man holding a world of violence and pain inside himself. He finished his stew and set the bowl aside, leaning his head back against the stone of the hearth, his eyes closed. He looked younger in repose. The harsh lines of his face softened, the wariness momentarily gone. Clara looked at this stranger she had dragged into her life, this silent, wounded man who was now a part of her isolation. A strange feeling stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't fear. It was something else, something raw and unfamiliar, a flicker of warmth in the cold, lonely landscape of her heart. She quickly looked away, back into the flames, her own heart thumping a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. This was a mistake. He was a mistake, but he was a mistake that was, for now, hers to keep. For 3 days, the world was a still, white tomb. The snow lay in heavy drifts against the cabin, muffling all sound, sealing them inside. On the 4th morning, a weak, watery sun appeared, and the temperature rose just enough to make the snow on the roof begin to weep. Eli felt the shift in the air like a change in pressure in his own blood. It was time to go. He had spent the days in a state of pained recovery, his shoulder a dull, persistent fire. He had followed her rules to the letter, chopping the kindling she'd brought inside, his movements slow and clumsy. He had said nothing, but he had watched her. He watched the economy of her movements, the way she never wasted a step or a gesture. He saw the deep-seated weariness in her that she tried to hide behind a spine of iron, and he felt, with a certainty that unsettled him, that the silence in this cabin was older and deeper than the rule she had laid between them. He found her outside, checking a snare line near the edge of the woods. Her back was to him. "My shoulder's better," he said. The words felt loud and rough in the clean, cold air. She didn't turn around. "It is not good enough," he insisted. "I'm leaving." Now she turned, her eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun on the snow. "You will not make it a mile. Another storm is coming." She gestured with her chin toward the horizon, where a line of bruised clouds was already gathering. "I'll take my chances," he said, his voice hard. He was a prisoner here, tended to and fed, but a prisoner all the same. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to put distance between himself and whatever was behind him, to put distance between himself and this woman, whose presence was a constant, sharp ache in the hollows of his own loneliness. He turned and walked back to the cabin without waiting for a reply. He found his coat, stiff and still smelling faintly of blood, and the shirt she had washed and laid out for him. He pulled them on, hissing as the movement pulled at the wound. He was strapping his gun belt back around his waist when the door flew open. It was her. Her face was flushed from the cold, her eyes blazing. Before he could react, she strode across the room and kicked the door shut with her boot. The heavy wood slammed into its frame with a resounding boom that shook the small cabin. "I said you are not leaving," she growled, her voice a low and dangerous thing. The wind had begun to howl outside again, a sudden, violent gust rattling the window pane. Snow began to skitter against the glass. He straightened up, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You cannot keep me here." "I can," she snapped, taking a step closer. "And I will. You think I dragged you out of the snow just to watch you walk back into it and die? You think I wasted my whiskey and my bandages on a fool? You are not strong enough to survive out there. You would be dead by nightfall." They stood there, inches apart, locked in a battle of wills. He could see the fierce, stubborn pride in her, but underneath it, he saw a flicker of something else, a desperate, raw fear. It was not a fear of him, he realized. It was a fear of being left alone again. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He slowly took his hand off his gun. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, heavy resignation. He was trapped by the storm and by the strange, unspoken debt he owed the furious woman in front of him. And so their tense routine began. The new blizzard lasted for a week, a relentless siege of wind and snow. Each morning, Eli would rise from his bedroll by the fire and begin his work. He chopped wood in the lean-to, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only conversation between them. He hauled buckets of water from the nearly frozen creek, his boots sinking deep into the fresh snow, his shoulders screaming with every step. He worked in silence, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Clara watched him. She watched him from the cabin window as he split logs, the muscles in his good arm cording with the effort. She saw the pain he tried to hide, the way he would pause and discreetly lean against the wood pile when he thought she was not looking. She watched him at night as he sat by the fire, his big hands turning a small piece of wood over and over, his thumb stroking the grain as if seeking some kind of comfort. There was a stillness to him, a coiled patience that spoke of a man long accustomed to waiting, to watching his back. A guarded interest grew in her, an unwelcome curiosity about the man who shared her prison. He was a danger, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of her solitude. But he was also a presence, a steady, breathing warmth in the vast, cold emptiness of her life. One evening, as she was mending a tear in her canvas coat, he broke the longest-standing rule. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet. She did not look up from her needle. "Why what? Why do you live out here alone?" Her fingers stilled. The needle hovered over the cloth. Rule 4. He had broken Rule 4. She felt a surge of hot anger, the fierce, protective instinct that rose whenever anyone got too close to the truth of her. She wanted to lash out, to tell him it was none of his business, to remind him of the terms of their arrangement. But the question hung in the air between them, simple and direct. "It is not your concern," she said, her voice tight and cold. She forced her fingers to move again, to push the needle through the thick fabric. He did not press her. He simply sat there, watching her, and his silence was more unnerving than any question. She could feel his eyes on her, feel him wondering, and in the quiet of the cabin, the ghosts she kept at bay began to stir. The memories came unbidden, sharp and painful as shards of glass, the terror and the agony of childbirth, alone in this very cabin, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, her body tearing, the world narrowing to a tunnel of white-hot pain. The face of the man who should have been with her, Jacob, swam in her mind, his thin, cruel mouth, the dismissive way his eyes had swept over the burned-out shell of a cabin and the pregnant woman he had sent for, sight unseen. He had not even stayed the night. The betrayal had been a cold, clean cut, leaving a wound that had festered into a bitter hatred for the world of men and their easy promises. And then the most painful memory of all, holding Rose, her small body burning with fever, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, the gut-wrenching helplessness, the frantic, useless prayers whispered into the night, the final, terrible silence when the breathing stopped, a silence that had swallowed her whole and had never truly left. She pushed the needle through the canvas with a vicious jab, pricking her finger. A single drop of dark red blood welled up. She stared at it, her own breathing suddenly shallow. She put the coat aside, her hands trembling. "I am going to bed," she announced to the empty air, and retreated to her cot in the corner, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin and turning her face to the wall. That night, The ghost came for her in her sleep. She was back in the cabin, but it was filled with menacing, whispering shadows. Jacob was there, his face sneering, calling her a cursed, used thing. The men from town were there, their faces twisted with judgment, and in the center of it all, a small, empty cradle rocked back and forth, its creaking the only sound in the suffocating silence. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped, drowning in a sea of shame and loss. She woke up with a raw, guttural scream tearing from her throat. She was sitting bolt upright on her cot, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs as if it wanted to break free. In an instant, Eli was there. He had thrown off his blankets and crossed the cabin in 2 long strides. He knelt by her cot, his face etched with concern in the dying firelight. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. He reached out to touch her shoulder, to still her violent trembling. His touch was like a lit match to dry tinder. "No!" she shrieked, scrambling away from him, pressing herself against the cold log wall. "Do not touch me! Get away from me!" She swiped at him with a wild, panicked strength, her hands flailing. She was a cornered animal, seeing only a threat, her mind still caught in the tendrils of the nightmare. Eli drew back as if he had been burned, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "All right," he said softly. "All right, I will not." He retreated back to his side of the hearth, his expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, sorrowful understanding. Clara stayed huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth until the sun began to cast a pale, gray light through the window. The next day was a torment of strained silence. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. Clara moved like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed and haunted. She avoided looking at him, but she could feel his gaze following her, questioning, probing. That afternoon, he followed her out to the back of the cabin. She was standing by the willow tree, staring down at the small mound of earth, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "There is a grave here," Eli said. It was not a question. Clara stiffened, her whole body going rigid. She turned on him, her eyes flashing with a fresh wave of fury. "I told you not to ask questions." "That was before last night," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I heard you. I saw your face. Whatever haunts you is tied to this place." He took a step closer. "Who is buried there?" "Clara?" It was the final trespass. He had pushed his way into the one sacred, private corner of her soul. Without thinking, she swung her arm, her open palm connecting with his cheek with a sharp, cracking sound. The force of the blow rocked him back on his heels, a dark red mark blooming instantly on his skin. He did not flinch. He did not get angry. He simply stood there, his dark eyes filled with a sad, steady compassion that was more undoing than any anger could have been. And that was what broke her. The slap had shattered the last of her defenses. A great, shuddering sob tore through her, a sound of such profound, bottomless grief that it seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. Her legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the snow, her face in her hands, the harsh, ugly sounds of her weeping the only sound in the winter quiet. Eli waited a moment. Then he slowly knelt in front of her, not touching her, but just being there. He waited until the storm of her sobs had subsided into ragged, exhausted gasps. "It was my daughter," she whispered, her voice broken, muffled by her hands. "Her name was Rose." He said nothing, his silence an invitation to continue. "She was not his," Clara choked out, the words tasting like poison. "The man who brought me here. She was from before, from a bad time." She finally dropped her hands and looked at him, her face ravaged by tears, her eyes pleading for some kind of understanding. "The town, they would have called her a bastard. They would have called me a whore. But she was mine. She was perfect." She looked over at the small grave. "The fever took her. right after her first birthday. There was nothing I could do. She had finally spoken her secret aloud. The weight of it, which she had carried alone for so long, now lay between them in the cold air. Eli looked from her tear-streaked face to the simple river stone marking the grave. A muscle tightened in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. "I am not just running from the cold, Clara," he said softly. She looked at him, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the sudden shift. "I am running from the law," he went on, his eyes holding hers. "There is a price on my head. I killed a man back in the Nebraska territory." He paused, and his gaze hardened. He was a powerful man, with friends in high places, but he hurt someone who could not fight back. A girl, not much older than your Rose might have been. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "So I made sure he could not hurt anyone ever again." Clara stared at him. The outlaw, the killer. That is what the world would call him. But what she heard was something else. She heard a man who understood injustice. She heard a man who had met cruelty with a final, terrible violence of his own. In his confession, she saw a dark, twisted reflection of her own protective rage. Her vulnerability had unlocked his, and in that shared, broken space, the walls between them began to crumble. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer a rule to be obeyed, but a space to be shared. A fragile truce had been declared. After they had eaten their meal, Clara did something she would not have thought herself capable of doing just a day before. She got up from her chair and walked over to where Eli sat on the floor, leaning against a stack of firewood. "Come," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Sit by the fire, on the chair." He looked up at her, surprised, but he did as she asked, taking the chair opposite hers. It was the closest they had ever sat. The fire crackled between them, its warmth pushing back the chill of the night. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, Clara stood up and moved her own chair, dragging it across the floorboards until it was right beside his. She sat down, her arms so close to his they were almost touching. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. Eli stiffened, every muscle in his body going taut. He stared into the fire, his jaw clenched. "Clara," he started, his voice a low, rough growl. She did not let him finish. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and laid her hand on the arm of his chair, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was electric, a spark of heat in the cold room. He flinched as if he had been burned, but he did not pull away. He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw, aching turmoil. "This ain't right," he growled, the words torn from him. "I do not care what is right," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She did not look at him, but she leaned just a fraction of an inch closer, a silent plea. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. He turned his gaze back to the fire, but he did not move his hand. They sat there for what felt like an eternity, side by side in the flickering light, their hands almost touching. A quiet, tender moment passed between them, filled with all the things they could not say. It was a raw, aching, and utterly restrained connection between two broken people who had, for the first time in a very long time, found a reason not to be alone. But for now, that was all it was. A beginning. A fragile, flickering flame in the vast, surrounding darkness. The Chinook wind arrived like a whispered promise, a warm breath from the mountains that spoke of a world beyond the snow. For the first time in weeks, the relentless grip of the cold loosened. Water began to drip from the eaves of the cabin in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, each drop a tiny hammer chipping away at the winter fortress. The air grew soft, and the suffocating silence of the snowbound landscape was replaced by the gentle sigh and gurgle of a world beginning to thaw. Inside the cabin, the change was just as palpable. The rigid silence between Clara and Eli had softened into something less defined. a space filled with the weight of their shared confessions. They still moved around each other with a careful, ingrained caution. But the sharp edges of their solitude had been worn smooth by a shared vulnerability. With the creek finally beginning to break free of its icy shell, the water barrel inside was running low. "The buckets need filling," Clara announced one morning, her tone practical, as if it were any other day. "The path will be slick with mud. I will need your help carrying them back." It was the first time she had asked for his help, rather than commanded his labor. Eli simply nodded, pulling on his boots. The walk to the stream was a struggle against the softening earth. The deep snow had become a treacherous slush, and the ground beneath was a thick, greedy mud that tried to suck the boots from their feet. They walked single file, Clara in the lead, her rifle resting in the crook of her arm. Eli followed, carrying the 2 empty wooden buckets, his gaze fixed on her back. The sun was a pale, welcome disk in the sky, and its light seemed to transform the harsh landscape. The snow-laden pines glittered, and the distant mountains, which had been a flat, gray wall, now had depth and texture. When they reached the clearing where the stream ran, the sound of moving water was almost a shock, a living sound in a world that had been frozen and still for so long. Clara leaned her rifle against a tree and knelt at the water's edge, pushing aside chunks of floating ice to clear a space. She dipped the first bucket, her movements strong and sure. As she straightened up, she pushed a loose strand of honey-blonde hair from her face, and the sunlight caught in it, turning it to a halo of spun gold. She looked up, her eyes scanning the opposite bank, and in that unguarded moment, with the light on her face and the sound of the creek filling the air, Eli saw her for the first time. He had seen the grim survivor, the angry caretaker, the grieving mother. He had seen her face pale with exhaustion in the dim light of the cabin and tight with fury in the shadows of her nightmares. But he had never truly seen her in the clear, honest light of day. He saw the sweep of her eyelashes, the stubborn set of her jaw that could not quite hide the softness of her mouth. He saw the faint freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose. She was not a classic beauty, not the kind of woman who turned heads in a saloon. Her features were too strong, her face too etched with hardship. But there was a raw, fierce beauty in her that struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the beauty of a lone pine clinging to a windswept ridge, a beauty forged in resilience and survival. The realization landed in his gut like a hot stone, an unwelcome and dangerous warmth. Clara felt his gaze and turned, her own eyes questioning. "What is it?" He looked away quickly, his face hardening back into its familiar mask. "Nothing," he grunted, taking the full bucket from her and setting it on a flat rock. He took the other bucket and began to fill it, his movements stiff. They made the return trip in that same charged silence. The full buckets were heavy, and they had to stop several times, their breath clouding in the cool air. They were halfway back to the cabin when Clara, in the lead, stopped dead. "Eli," she said, her voice low. He came up beside her, standing in a small clearing, looking lost and forlorn. Was a horse. It was a fine-looking sorrel, but its head was down, and one of its reins was dragging on the ground. Its saddle was twisted at an ugly angle, the cinch strap broken. The horse was favoring its right foreleg. Clara began to approach it slowly, making soft, calming noises. But Eli did not move. He was staring at the brand on the horse's flank, a simple circle R. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He knew that brand. It belonged to the Rocking R Ranch, a spread 200 miles east, near the Nebraska border. It was country he knew well. It was country he had fled from. "Someone was thrown," Clara said, finally getting a hand on the horse's neck. "Poor thing, the saddle's broken." Eli's eyes were scanning the woods, the surrounding ridges, his whole body coiled and tense. "Or someone was shot off him," he said, his voice grim. This was not a random stray. This was a message from the world he was running from. It was a sign that the world was catching up. He took the reins from Clara. "Let us get it back to the cabin. We will see to its leg." His tone was clipped, his movements efficient, but Clara saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes never stopped moving. The fragile peace of the morning had been shattered. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with a new kind of anxiety. The horse was settled in a small, makeshift lean-to, its leg bound, but its presence was a constant, unspoken question between them. Eli was restless. He paced the small floor, unable to settle, his hand straying again and again to the butt of his pistol. Clara watched him until she could not stand it any longer. "That brand," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You recognized it?" He stopped pacing and turned to face her. In the flickering firelight, the scar above his eyes seemed to deepen. "I did," he admitted. "You think whoever was riding him is looking for you." He gave a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Not just anyone. Clara, a lawman, a United States Marshal named Elias Thorne. He's been hunting me for 6 months." He finally came and sat in the chair opposite hers, leaning forward, his forearms on his knees. He looked not at her, but into the flames, as if the story were written there. "The man I killed, his name was Sterling. He was not just some saloon brawler. He ran things. He had his hands in everything, from cattle to land to people." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a terrible memory. "He ran a ring, bringing in girls from the East on the promise of good work, then selling them to mining camps and lonely ranchers. They were trapped, with nowhere to go. They were his property." Clara felt a cold dread seep into her veins. "I was working at a nearby ranch," Eli continued, his voice low and flat. "There was a girl there. Mary, she was quiet, scared. Sterling had his eye on her. One night, he took her. I found her the next morning in the stables. He had used her up and left her there like a piece of trash. Something inside of me broke." His hands clenched into tight fists. "I went after him. I did not call the sheriff. Sterling owned the sheriff. I went to his office, and I made sure he would never lay his hands on another girl again." He fell silent, the crackle of the fire filling the void. "Thorne, the marshal. He is Sterling's cousin. This is not about the law for him. It is about blood. He will not stop until he sees me at the end of a rope, or in a pine box." Now she understood. She understood the haunted look in his eyes, the way he slept so lightly, the reason he had insisted on silence. He was not just a man who had made a mistake. He was a man who had delivered a righteous judgment and been condemned for it by a corrupt world. His raw honesty demanded the same from her. It was as if his confession had unlocked the last bolted door in her own heart. "The man who brought me here," she began, her own voice barely a whisper. "His name was Jacob Fuller." Eli's gaze shifted from the fire to her face, giving her his full, solemn attention. "He was a merchant from back east, a man with money and a cold heart. He bought this land, and he bought me. I was a mail-order bride, a piece of property, just like those girls you talked about." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. He arrived, took one look at this half-burned cabin, and then he looked at me. I was already showing. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. I was pregnant with Rose. It had happened before I even knew of him. He did not ask. He did not care. He said he had not paid for damaged goods. He turned his horse around and rode away. He left me here, with nothing but a sack of flour and a child in my belly that was not his. She finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears of rage and humiliation. The people in town, they knew he had left. They saw me, my belly growing bigger. They started to whisper, "The cursed bride, the fallen woman." They blamed me. They said I must have driven him off. They said I was unclean. Not one of them, not one, ever blamed him. A low, animalistic growl rumbled deep in Eli's chest. His face was a thundercloud. his eyes blazing with a vicarious fury. "I would have killed him," he said, his voice shaking with a violence that was all for her. "I would have put a bullet in that man's black heart and not lost a moment's sleep over it." His rage was a balm to her wounded soul, but it was also a spark to the dry tinder of her own long-suppressed anger. "And what good would that have done?" she shot back, her own voice rising. "It would not have stopped the whispers. It would not have saved my daughter. It would not have changed anything." "It would have been justice," he roared, standing up so fast his chair scraped back on the floorboards. "Men like that, men like Sterling, men like your Jacob, they count on good people to do nothing. They feast on silence and fear." "And what do men like you do?" she cried, rising to face him. "You answer violence with more violence. You leave bodies and broken lives behind you. You run until you collapse in someone else's snow, bringing your trouble right to their door." They stood inches apart, their chests heaving, their faces flushed in the firelight. Their shared pain, their shared rage at the world's injustice, had boiled over, creating a raw, powerful current that arced between them. The air was thick with it, with the scent of pine smoke and the years of their unspoken grief. His eyes locked on hers, and the fury in them began to change, morphing into something else, something deeper and more dangerous. "Maybe I did," he said, his voice dropping to a rough, ragged whisper. "Maybe I brought my trouble right where it belongs." And then he closed the distance between them. His hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, and his mouth came down on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. It was rough and desperate and honest, filled with all the anger and pain and loneliness they had just laid bare. It was the taste of whiskey and wood smoke and unshed tears. Clara's hands came up to fist in his shirt, her body pressing against his, returning the kiss with a ferocity that matched his own. This was not a surrender. It was a claiming. It was two drowning people clinging to each other in a storm, a desperate, defiant act of life in the face of so much death. His hands moved from her neck down her back, pulling her flush against him, and she could feel the hard, wanting strength of his body. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, their breathing harsh and ragged in the quiet cabin. "Clara," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse. He lifted her then, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her the few steps to the thick bearskin rug in front of the hearth. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, asking a question for which there were no words. She answered by reaching up and pulling him down to her. Their coming together was as fierce and as urgent as their kiss. It was a frantic shedding of layers, of clothes and armor, of the solitude that had been their only shield for so long. It was the desperate press of skin against skin in the warm, flickering light, a search for solace in the landscape of another's scars. It was more than a physical act. It was an exorcism. With every touch, every gasp, every frantic meeting of their bodies, they were driving out the ghosts of their pasts, the Jacobs and the Sterlings, the whispers and the judgments. It was a moment of pure, emotional surrender, a raw and beautiful collision of pain and need. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the rug, their bodies slick with sweat, the firelight washing over them. The only sound was the crackle of the logs on the fire and the sound of their own hearts slowly returning to a normal rhythm. The storm of their passion had passed, leaving in its wake a profound and terrifying intimacy. Eli stirred first. The weight of what they had done seemed to settle on him. He looked at her, at the flushed softness of her skin, at the way the firelight caught in the damp strands of her hair. He had crossed a line. He had brought his darkness into her world and tainted the one clean thing he had found in it. He started to pull away, to rise, to put the space back between them that he felt he did not deserve to cross. But her hand shot out and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide and luminous in the dim light. "Do not go," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep and emotion. "Not tonight. He hesitated, his body tensed to leave, but he saw the plea in her eyes, a fragile, desperate hope that mirrored the one he had tried so hard to kill in himself. Slowly, he sank back down beside her. He pulled a heavy wool blanket over them, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her close against his side. Outside, the Chinook wind picked up again, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves of the cabin. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms in the warm glow of the fire, their long, lonely winters finally began to melt. Clara woke to a profound and terrifying emptiness. The first gray light of dawn was filtering into the cabin, and the space beside her on the bearskin rug was cold. She reached out a hand, her fingers finding only the rough fur where his body had been. A knot of pure, cold panic tightened in her stomach. He was gone. She sat up, pulling the wool blanket around her nakedness, her heart hammering a frantic, sick rhythm against her ribs. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with the chill of early morning. She scanned the small room. His boots were gone from their place by the hearth. His gun belt was not on the peg where he had hung it. Of course he was gone. After everything. After she had let him in. After she had broken every rule she had ever set for herself. He had slipped away in the pre-dawn darkness like a thief. The shame of it was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She had been a fool. A lonely, desperate fool who had mistaken a shared moment of desperation for something real. The old, familiar walls of her solitude began to close in around her, colder and more suffocating than ever before. She forced herself to her feet, her body aching with a soreness that was both physical and emotional. She pulled on her clothes with numb, clumsy fingers, refusing to cry. Tears were a luxury she had given up long ago. She would survive this. She had survived worse. She would go back to her rituals, to the chopping and the hauling, and she would bury this memory alongside all the others. She pushed open the cabin door, expecting to see nothing but an empty, snow-draped landscape, perhaps his fading footprints leading away from her. The air was sharp and clean, the world painted in the soft blues and pinks of sunrise. And then she saw him. He was not gone. He was by the small, dilapidated corral where she kept her 2 goats, and he was working. He had taken down a section of the rotting broken fence and was digging new post holes in the thawing earth with her shovel. Several sturdy lengths of fresh-cut pine were laid out on the ground beside him. He had his coat off despite the chill, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and the muscles in his back and arms moved with a powerful, steady rhythm as he worked. He was not fleeing. He was building. The relief that washed over Clara was so total, so overwhelming, that her knees went weak. She leaned against the doorframe for support, a ragged, shuddering breath escaping her lips. He had not left. He had stayed, and he was mending her broken fence. It was such a simple, practical thing. Yet it felt like the grandest gesture she had ever witnessed. It was an act of permanence, of intention. It was the answer to a question she had been too afraid to even ask. He must have sensed her, because he stopped digging and looked up, his face breaking into a slow, weary smile that transformed his harsh features. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it sent a dizzying, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. "The fence was falling apart," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Figured the goats would appreciate a bit more security." She walked toward him, her boots sinking into the soft mud, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She stopped a few feet away, her heart too full for words. She simply looked at him, at the sweat on his brow and the dirt on his hands, and she felt a wave of such profound tenderness it almost brought her to her knees again. He leaned the shovel against a post and walked to her, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stopped in front of her, his smile fading as he saw the lingering trace of fear and devastation in her eyes. "You thought I was gone," he said softly. She could only nod, feeling the hot sting of tears behind her eyes. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough and calloused against her skin. "Clara," he said, his voice low and solemn. "I am not going anywhere. I am staying for as long as you will have me." "For how long is that, Eli?" she whispered, the question full of a lifetime of abandonment. "For as long as you will have me," he repeated, as if it were a sacred vow. And then he leaned in and kissed her, a soft, gentle kiss that was full of the promise of the morning sun. It was a kiss that sealed the bargain their bodies had made in the firelight, a kiss that said, "Instead of you and I." The peace that followed was a fragile, miraculous thing. For the first time, the cabin did not feel like a prison, but a home. They worked side by side, a comfortable silence settling between them, punctuated by easy conversation. They repaired the fence, they patched the roof properly, they planned a small garden plot. It was a quiet, domestic rhythm that was utterly foreign to Clara, and she found herself sinking into it like a warm bath. The harsh lines of her face began to soften. A small, tentative smile would sometimes touch her lips as she watched him work. The happiness was so new, so delicate, that she was terrified it would break. And 2 days later, it did. They were inside, sharing a midday meal of bread and salted pork, when the sound came, the rhythmic, steady thud of a horse's hooves. Coming up the path to the cabin, it was not the sound of a wandering stray. It was the sound of a rider with a purpose. Instantly, the peace was shattered. Eli was on his feet, his body rigid, his hand already on the pistol he now wore at all times. The relaxed, smiling man of the past 2 days was gone, replaced by the wary, hunted outlaw. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She went to the window and peered cautiously through a crack in the shutter. A man on a big bay horse was riding into the clearing. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a thick, dark beard and a heavy buffalo coat. But it was the glint of sun on metal that made Clara's blood run cold. A tin star was pinned to his coat. "It is a lawman," she breathed, turning from the window, her face pale. Eli's face was a grim mask. He moved silently to the other side of the door, drawing his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the small cabin. "Do not open the door," he said, his voice a low command. But the man was already dismounting. A moment later, a heavy fist pounded on the door. "Hello in the cabin? I am looking for shelter from the wind and a word with the lady of the house." Clara looked at Eli, her eyes wide with panic. He shook his head, his expression fierce. But they both knew a lone woman could not refuse a lawman's request for a parley. It would look too suspicious. "I will handle it," she mouthed silently. She took a deep, steadying breath and walked to the door, her own pistol now clutched in her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Name's Riggs, ma'am." The voice boomed back. "Carrying a badge and looking for a fugitive. Just need to ask you a few questions." Clara slid the bolt and opened the door just a crack, keeping her body in the opening. The man, Riggs, stood on her porch, his eyes small and sharp like a boar's. They swept over her, then tried to peer into the dimness of the cabin behind her. "What business does the law have this far out?" Clara asked, her tone cold. Riggs gave a smile that did not reach his eyes. "My business is a man named Eli. Goes by a few other names. Killed a man back in Nebraska. He was seen heading up this way. Big fellow, dark hair, got a scar through his eyebrow. You seen anyone like that?" Clara's heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but she kept her face a mask of weary indifference. She let her eyes drift past him, as if scanning the empty landscape. "I have seen no one," she said, her voice flat. "I live alone. No one comes out this way." Riggs's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his bulk crowding the doorway. "You are sure about that, ma'am? There is a fresh mended fence over there. Looks like a man's work. And I see 2 sets of tracks in the mud. One of them from a big pair of boots." Panic flared in Clara's throat, hot and suffocating. She had to force the words out. I am more capable than I look, she said, injecting a note of steel into her voice. And I borrowed my neighbor's boy to help with the fence a few days back. He is long gone now. It was a clumsy lie, but it was the only one she could think of. The bounty hunter stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze boring into her, trying to find a crack in her story. He sniffed the air. Smells like coffee in there. Smells like 2 cups worth. I like coffee, Clara snapped, her patience, real or feigned, wearing thin. Is that against the law as well? He held her gaze for another second, then finally gave a curt nod, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was not convinced, but he had no proof. All right, ma'am. Sorry to have troubled you, but if you do see him, there is a $500 reward. You send word to the sheriff in redemption, and it is yours. He tipped his hat and turned, lumbering back to his horse. Clara watched him mount, her body trembling with the strain of the lie. He reined his horse around and gave the cabin one last, long look before riding away. She did not close the door until he was completely out of sight, a dark speck disappearing over the ridge. Only then did she slide the bolt home and lean back against the door, her legs giving way. She slid down to the floor, the pistol clattering from her nerveless fingers. Eli was beside her in an instant, holstering his own weapon and kneeling in front of her. You did good, Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You did real good. She looked up at him, her eyes wild with the aftermath of her fear. The relief was already evaporating, replaced by the cold, terrifying truth of their situation. The outside world had found them. The monster from his past was real, and it had a name and a badge. Are you worth it? She asked, her voice a raw, ragged whisper. She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. I just lied to a man with a gun and a badge. I could be hanged for that. He could have shot me where I stood. So you tell me, Eli, are you worth dying for? The question hung between them, brutal and honest. She saw a flicker of profound pain in his eyes. He had no answer for her. He could not promise her that he was worth the risk. He could not promise her a future, or safety, or anything but the danger that followed him like a shadow. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, his face a mask of anguish. And in his silence, she found her own terrible answer. It did not matter if he was worth it. She had already made her choice. That night, the easy comfort between them was gone, replaced by a heavy, sorrowful tension. They ate their dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The bounty hunter's visit had been a stark reminder that their peaceful world was an illusion, a small, fragile bubble that could be burst at any moment. Later, as they sat by the fire, Eli finally broke the silence. He came to her, kneeling before her chair. He did not speak, but he took her hand and brought it to his lips. Then he looked up at her, his eyes full of a deep, wrenching pain. He leaned in and kissed her, his lips trembling against hers. It was a kiss of gratitude and despair, of love and of fear. He pulled back, his hands shaking as they framed her face. I never asked anyone to save me, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. I never wanted to bring this to you. You did not, she whispered back, her own tears finally falling. I chose it. He led her to the bearskin rug, and they came together again in the warm glow of the fire. But this time was different. It was not the desperate, frantic coupling of their first time. It was slow. It was reverent. It was a quiet, solemn act of two people clinging to each other in the dark. His hands moved over her with a gentle reverence, tracing the faint stretch marks on her belly, the old scar on her knee, as if he were memorizing a sacred map. Her hands explored the landscape of his back, the puckered skin of a bullet wound, the raised welts of old whip marks, the geography of his own pain. They moved together in a slow, silent rhythm, their scarred bodies seeking not release, but forgiveness. It was a prayer for absolution in a world that had offered them none. In the days that followed, a strange and defiant hope began to take root in Clara's heart. The bounty hunter's visit, instead of driving them apart, had forged their bond into something stronger, something tempered by shared danger. For the first time since she had arrived in this desolate place, she began to think about the future not as something to be endured, but as something to be built. One afternoon, she sat at the table with a piece of charcoal and a scrap of wrapping paper, sketching. Eli came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder. It was a rough, simple drawing of the cabin, but next to it was a new structure, a barn, with a proper hayloft and stalls for horses. "I was thinking," she said, a faint blush on her cheeks, "if we could get some horses, maybe a few head of cattle, this could be a real ranch. We could make this place into something." Eli looked at the drawing, then at her, his heart aching with a love so fierce it almost hurt to breathe. He saw the fragile hope in her eyes, the dream of a future she was daring to have with him, and he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He put his hands on her shoulders and squeezed gently. "I think that is a fine idea. Clara," he said, his voice thick. The next day, she gave him a small cloth bag. "These are from my mother," she said. "Carried them all the way from Missouri." Inside were seeds, beans, squash, and corn. She took him to the small, protected patch of earth on the south side of the cabin, the place where the sun was warmest. The ground was soft and dark, ready for planting. She watched as he knelt and pushed the seeds into the thawing earth with his large, gentle hands. A small, wobbly smile touched her lips. There was so much hope in that simple act, so much faith in the turning of the seasons, in the promise of a harvest. For a fleeting, perfect moment, they were not a fugitive and a cursed bride. They were just a man and a woman, planting a garden, daring to believe in a future. It was a look of such fragile happiness that it made Eli's heart both soar and break. But even in these moments of quiet joy, the shadow remained. Clara was not a fool. She saw the way Eli's head would snap up at the sound of a cracking branch in the woods. She saw how his hand always rested on the butt of his pistol when he was outside. She saw the way he would stand on the porch at dusk, his eyes scanning the horizon, a haunted look on his face. She knew, with a cold, clear certainty, that their peace was not real. It was a beautiful, precious thing they were building together. But it was built on borrowed time, and she knew, sooner or later, the bill would come due. The borrowed time lasted for a week. It was a week of such quiet, domestic peace that it felt like a dream Clara was afraid to wake from. They worked in the garden they had planted, their hands in the same soil. Eli finished the corral, its new pine posts standing straight and strong against the skyline. He even began to split logs for the new barn she had sketched, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady, reassuring heartbeat in her small world. They talked, not of the past or the uncertain future, but of small things, the best way to smoke a ham, the names of the constellations that glittered in the cold, clear nights. They fell asleep each night in front of the fire, their limbs tangled together, their breathing synchronized. For the first time, Clara's cabin was filled not with ghosts, but with a fragile, burgeoning life. But the fear was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their peace. Eli never truly relaxed. A sudden noise would make him go still, his head cocked, his body tensed like a bowstring. He spent long periods on the porch, his eyes fixed on the distant trail, a grim, thoughtful expression on his face. Clara knew he was turning something over in his mind, wrestling with a problem that had no easy solution. The bounty hunter, Riggs, was not a man to give up easily. He was out there somewhere, asking questions, sniffing the air, waiting. They were living on a knife's edge, and the waiting was a torment worse than any confrontation. Eli came to a decision one evening as they were cleaning up after their meal. He looked at Clara, at the new softness around her eyes and the way a genuine smile now came so easily to her lips. And he knew he could not let her live like this, waiting for violence to arrive on her doorstep. He could not be the reason that fragile happiness was ripped away from her. He waited until she was sound asleep, her breathing deep and even. He leaned over and pressed the softest of kisses to her forehead. A silent, painful farewell. Then he slipped out of their bed of blankets, his movements as silent as a shadow. He pulled on his boots, strapped on his gun belt, and wrote a short, crude note on the back of her barn sketch, weighting it down on the table with a rock. "I will be back. Do not worry." It was a lie, and they both would know it, but it was kinder than the truth. The truth was, he was going to Redemption to draw the trouble away from her, to see if he could learn what Riggs was planning, and, if necessary, to lead him on a chase far away from this cabin and the woman who had made it a home. He saddled the sorrel, the horse now fully recovered, its presence a constant reminder of the world beyond these hills. He swung into the saddle and gave the cabin one last, long, aching look. Then he turned the horse and rode out under the cold light of a half-moon, melting into the darkness of the pines. The town of Redemption was just beginning to stir when he arrived. He tethered the horse in a thicket a good mile out and walked the rest of the way, entering the town from the rear, keeping to the shadows of the alleyways. He pulled his hat down low, his collar up high, hoping the stubble on his face and the dirt of the trail would be enough of a disguise. His plan was simple: get to the saloon, listen to the talk, and get out. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer and desperation. A few early risers were nursing drinks at the bar, their faces gray in the morning light. Eli took a seat in a dark corner. Ordering a whiskey he had no intention of drinking. He kept his eyes and ears open, picking up snippets of conversations about cattle prices, a broken wagon wheel, a new preacher. There was no mention of a bounty hunter, no talk of a fugitive. A small, cautious tendril of hope began to curl in his gut. Maybe Riggs had moved on. Maybe the trail had gone cold. He was about to get up and leave when the batwing door swung open, letting in a shaft of bright, dusty sunlight. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a man Eli recognized with a jolt of pure, cold dread. It was not Riggs. It was a deputy from back in Nebraska, a man named Miller, a man squarely in Sterling's pocket, and pinned to the wall right behind the bar, half hidden by a rack of dusty bottles, was a wanted poster. On it was a crude but unmistakable sketch of his own face. Miller's eyes swept the room, and for a terrifying second, they passed right over Eli. Then they snapped back, a flicker of recognition dawning. The deputy's hand dropped to his gun. "You!" he growled. "Eli." All the noise in the saloon ceased. Every eye turned to their corner. The moment of stillness seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then Eli kicked his chair back, flipping the small table over and sending his whiskey glass crashing to the floor. As Miller drew his weapon, Eli was already moving, diving sideways, drawing his own pistol in a single, fluid motion. He did not shoot. He could not risk a stray bullet hitting an innocent man. He crashed through the saloon's grimy side window in a shower of splintered wood and glass, landing hard in the muddy alleyway outside. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain from the cuts on his arms, and began to run. A gunshot exploded behind him, the bullet splintering the corner of a building inches from his head. "Stop him," Miller yelled. $500 to the man who stops him." Suddenly, the whole town seemed to come alive. Men poured out of the saloon and the nearby buildings, some with guns, all with the greedy glint of reward money in their eyes. Eli sprinted down the alley, his boots pounding in the mud. He vaulted a low fence, crashing through a backyard where a woman screamed and dropped her laundry basket. He could hear them behind him, shouting, their footsteps closing in. He made it to the edge of town, to the open country, but he knew he would never outrun them on foot. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw Miller, his face purple with rage, taking careful aim. Eli zigzagged, making himself a harder target. Another shot rang out, and this time he felt a white-hot, searing pain tear along his side. He stumbled, his hand flying to his ribs. and when he pulled it away, it was covered in blood. He had been hit. He grit his teeth against the pain and forced himself to keep running, his vision starting to blur at the edges. The thicket where he had left the horse seemed 1,000 miles away. He could hear the posse getting closer, their shouts growing louder. He was losing blood, his legs feeling heavy as lead. He was not going to make it. Just as despair began to set in, he saw it. The sorrel, spooked by the gunshots, had pulled its reins free and was trotting nervously at the edge of the woods. With the last of his strength, Eli surged forward. He grabbed the reins, hauled himself into the saddle, his wounded side screaming in protest, and kicked the horse into a desperate gallop. Bullets whizzed past his head as he disappeared into the cover of the trees, leaving the town of Redemption and its greedy inhabitants behind. The ride back to the cabin was a nightmare of pain and fading consciousness. He clung to the horse's neck, the world a dizzying, red-tinged blur. Every jolt sent a fresh wave of agony through him. He did not know how long he rode, his only thought to get back to Clara, to the one safe place he had left in the world. He fell more than dismounted when he finally reached the clearing, collapsing in a heap in the mud not 10 feet from the front door, the horse standing over him, its sides heaving. Clara found him there. She had seen the note, and her morning had been a torment of anxiety. When she heard the horse, she had run outside, a terrible premonition gripping her heart. The sight of him, pale and covered in blood, his shirt soaked a dark, ugly red, broke through her fear and left only a cold, fierce determination. This time, there was no anger in her hands, no bitterness in her heart. She half dragged, half carried him inside, her movements fueled by a desperate, loving strength. She laid him on the bearskin rug, the same place where they had first found each other, and her hands were gentle as she cut away his shirt. The wound was a long, ugly gash along his ribs, the bullet having torn through the flesh without hitting bone. It was bleeding freely, but it was not fatal. He had been lucky. She worked quickly, her face a mask of concentration. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly soft, and stitched it closed with a steady hand, her movements economical and sure. She bandaged it tightly, then covered him with a blanket. He was conscious the whole time, his eyes following her every move, his face pale and etched with pain and self-loathing. When she was finished, she knelt beside him, her hands trembling now that the work was done. She looked at his pale face, at the fresh stitches on his side, and all the fear and love she felt for him rose up in a suffocating wave. "Let me help you," she begged, her voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Riggs, that deputy, they will be back. They will not stop looking. We can pack what we can carry. We can run, together. We can go north, to the territories. Find a place where no one knows us." Eli slowly shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "No," he rasped, his voice weak. "No more running." He reached up and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Clara, listen to me." He struggled to sit up, leaning against a pile of firewood. "I have been running my whole life, from one ranch to the next, one town to the next, never putting down roots, never letting anyone get close." He looked around the small, simple cabin, his gaze lingering on the garden tools in the corner, on the sketch of the barn still on the table. "This is the only place I ever felt human, the only place I ever felt home." He looked back at her, his eyes full of a terrible, beautiful clarity. "I am tired of running. I will not hide any more. If they are coming, let them come." His words were like a slap. All her carefully constructed hope, her desperate plans for their survival, crumbled into dust. "So that is it?" she cried, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. "You will just stay here and die? You will let them hang you or shoot you down in my yard?" "If that is what it takes," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "No!" she shouted, scrambling to her feet. "I will not let you. I did not save your life twice just to watch you throw it away." The argument was a storm. a clash of her desperate will to live and his profound weariness of the fight. She paced the cabin like a caged animal, her fists clenched at her sides. I want a life with you, Eli, not a memory. I want to build that barn. I want to plant that garden year after year. I do not want to bury you next to my daughter. The words burst from her, raw and full of a pain that went deeper than just him. She stopped and faced him, her body trembling, her face wet with tears. Do not die in my bed, she whispered, her voice shattered. Do not die in my home like everyone else I have ever loved. The raw agony in her voice finally broke through his resolve. He saw that his stand was not just about his own honor. It was an act of profound cruelty to her. He was asking her to watch him die, to add another grave to her haunted land. He had no answer to her plea. He could only watch as she turned and fled the cabin, the sound of her sobs lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the hills. That night, he made his decision. He could not stay and bring death to her door, and he could not ask her to run with him, to live the life of a fugitive. The only way to truly save her was to leave. He waited until the moon was high, until he was sure she was asleep. He had seen her go out to the willow tree, and he knew she would be there. He wrote a second note, this one longer, trying to explain the things he could not say. He packed a small bundle of food, checked the bandage on his side, the bleeding had stopped, and quietly let himself out of the cabin. He started toward the corral, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. But as he passed the willow tree, he stopped. She was there, just as he had known she would be. She had fallen asleep in the grass beside the small, stone-marked grave, curled up like a child, her face stained with dried tears, and clutched in her hand, held tight against her cheek, was a small, faded blue ribbon. The sight of it broke him. The ribbon, the last, tangible piece of her lost child, the symbol of her deepest, most profound grief. He saw it all in that one, heartbreaking image. He saw that leaving her would not save her from pain. It would just be a different kind of death, another abandonment, another grave in her heart. He saw that his fight was not just his own anymore. It was hers, too. Silently, he walked to her side. He knelt in the grass, the dampness seeping through his trousers. He looked from her sleeping, grief-stricken face to the simple stone that marked the resting place of her daughter. He gently took the note he had written and tore it into small pieces, letting them scatter like snowflakes on the ground. He lay down beside her, careful not to wake her, and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent, and snuggled deeper into his warmth. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent. He felt the small, fragile strength of her in his arms, and a fierce, protective love surged through him, washing away all his fear and weariness. He had been wrong. Running was not the answer. Fighting was. She woke a few moments later, her eyes fluttering open to find herself wrapped in his arms. She went still, her body tense. Eli? She whispered into the darkness. I am here, he said, his voice a low rumble against her back. I am not leaving. He held her a little tighter. If I die. Clara, he whispered, his lips against her hair. It will be fighting to come back to you. She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes searching his in the moonlight. She saw the truth there, the terrible, beautiful finality of his decision. He was staying. He was fighting. For her. For them. She said nothing, but she raised a hand and gently touched the scar on his eyebrow. They spent what they both knew might be their last night together right there, under the shelter of the weeping willow, beside the small, sacred grave. They did not talk. They simply held each other, two small, solitary figures against the vast, indifferent landscape. Above them, the wind began to rise, sweeping down from the mountains, making the stars glitter with a cold, hard fire. They held on tight, as if they could shield each other from the violence they knew the morning light would bring, under a dark Wyoming sky that was full of wind and the promise of fire. The dawn broke cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and delicate rose. It was a beautiful, deceptive peace. They had not slept, but had watched the stars fade one by one, holding each other against the chill and the unspoken dread of what was to come. They were inside the cabin now, a small fire crackling in the hearth, when they heard it. Not the sound of a lone rider, but the muffled thud of multiple horses, their steps careful and deliberate. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the weariness of the night vanishing, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. He moved to the window, peering through the smallest of cracks. 3 riders. Riggs was in the center, his heavy frame unmistakable even at a distance. The other 2 were lean, hard-faced men, the kind who sold their guns to the highest bidder. They were not coming to talk. They were fanning out, their rifles already drawn, their movements a clear, methodical encirclement of the cabin. "Clara," Eli said, his voice low and urgent, his back pressed against the wall. "Get to the root cellar. The door is under the rug. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Clara was standing by the hearth, her own rifle in her hands. She had been cleaning it when the riders arrived, and she had not put it down. She looked from the window to Eli's grim, determined face. She saw the terror he was trying to hide, a terror not for himself, but for her. And in that moment, she felt not fear, but a cold, clarifying rage. "No," she said, her voice quiet but as unyielding as the mountains outside. She pumped a shell into the chamber, the sound a sharp, definitive click in the tense silence. "You came into my home. Eli, you brought your trouble here, and I chose to keep you. This is my land. This is my house. I am not hiding in my own home." Before he could argue, a voice boomed from outside, thick with menace. "Eli, we know you are in there. Miller sent word you were wounded. Come on out, and we will make it quick. My associates are getting impatient." It was Riggs. Eli moved to the other window, his pistol now in his hand. He glanced at Clara, at the stubborn set of her jaw and the steady way she held the rifle. He saw not a frightened woman, but a warrior defending her territory. A fierce, terrible pride swelled in his chest. He gave her a short, sharp nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fate. They were in this together. "You tell your hired guns they are welcome to try," Eli shouted back, his voice ringing with a defiance he did not entirely feel. The answer was a splintering crash as a bullet tore through the shuttered window, burying itself in the opposite wall. The siege had begun. What followed was a terrifying symphony of chaos. Gunshots exploded, the sound deafening in the small space. Wood splintered from the walls and the door as bullets tore through them. Eli and Clara moved low, using the sparse furniture for cover, firing back through the small gaps in the windows. Eli was a seasoned fighter, his movements economical, his shots carefully aimed. He was trying to drive them back, to wound, not necessarily to kill. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the guns. Her world had narrowed to the small V of her rifle sight. She was not thinking. She was pure instinct, a primal need to protect this man, this home, this fragile life they had started to build. One of the hired guns made a foolish mistake. Impatient, he broke cover and made a run for the blind spot at the side of the cabin. Eli was occupied with Riggs, who was laying down a heavy covering fire from behind the woodpile. Clara saw the man, a dark, fleeting shape against the snow. She brought the rifle to her shoulder, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, the recoil a brutal, solid punch. The man stumbled, a look of profound surprise on his face. He clutched at his chest, where a dark stain was already blossoming on his shirt. He took 2 more wavering steps and then collapsed face down in the mud, his rifle clattering beside him. Clara stared, her mind blank, the world silent except for a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She had just killed a man. The thought was a distant, clinical observation, devoid of emotion. There was no time for horror, no time for regret. Eli saw it happen. He saw the man fall, and he saw the stunned, blank look on Clara's face. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice cutting through her shock. "Stay down!" His warning came a second too late. Riggs, enraged by the loss of one of his men, rose from behind the woodpile, his face a mask of fury, and fired a wild shot toward Clara's window. The bullet tore through the thin wall, and Eli cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He stumbled back, his hand clutching his good shoulder, a fresh patch of red seeping through his shirt. He was hit again. Seeing Eli fall was what broke through Clara's shock. A white-hot, protective fury surged through her, burning away all thought. She raised her rifle again, but the remaining hired gun, seeing his partner fall and his employer's wild rage, had had enough. This was more than a simple bounty hunt. He fired one last unaimed shot at the cabin and then turned and ran for his horse, disappearing into the trees. Riggs let out a string of curses after his fleeing man, then turned his full, furious attention back to the cabin. He was alone now, but he was a man driven by vengeance. He began to reload, preparing for a final, desperate charge. But Eli, gritting his teeth against the searing pain in his shoulder, had struggled back to the window. He rested his pistol on the sill, took careful aim, and fired. The shot was not aimed to kill. It was aimed to end the fight. The bullet struck the rifle in Riggs's hands, the impact tearing the weapon from his grasp and sending it spinning into the snow. Riggs howled, more in frustration than in pain, clutching his stinging hands. He was disarmed and alone. The fight was over. He gave the cabin one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred, then turned and lumbered toward his own horse, defeated. The silence that descended was more profound and more terrifying than the noise had been. It was filled with the smell of ozone and spent gunpowder, with the sight of the splintered, violated walls of their home. And outside, a man lay dead in the mud. Clara rushed to Eli's side. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a painful but not a mortal wound. Again, she helped him to the floor, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unbutton his shirt. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice trembling. The world was beginning to rush back in, the horror of what she had done, the terror of what had almost happened. She was tending to his wound, her tears finally falling, hot and silent on his skin, when they heard the sound of another rider. This one was slow, unhurried, both of them tensed, their hands reaching for their weapons, but the voice that called out was weary and familiar. "Hello in the cabin. This is Sheriff Thompson from Redemption. I heard some gunfire. I am coming in slow." A few moments later, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with a graying mustache and tired eyes appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. The bullet-riddled room, Eli on the floor, bleeding, Clara kneeling beside him with a bloody rag in her hand. His gaze drifted to the window, to the body lying outside. He sighed, a long, deep sound of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "Seems I am a little late to the party," he said dryly. He holstered his pistol and walked into the room, his boots scuffing on the floorboards. "I reckon you two have got some explaining to do." And so they told him. They told him everything. Eli, his voice weak but steady, told him about Sterling and the trafficking ring, about Mary, and about why Marshall Thorne, Riggs's employer, wanted him dead. Clara, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger, told him how Eli had arrived, half dead, in a blizzard. She told him about Riggs's first visit, and about the attack that morning. She did not shy away from her part in it. "I shot him," she said, looking the sheriff straight in the eye. "The man outside. He was going to kill us." Sheriff Thompson listened patiently. his expression unreadable. When they were finished, he walked to the door and looked out at the dead man for a long time. Then he came back and sat down at the small wooden table, rubbing his weary eyes. "I got a telegram this morning," he said, his voice quiet, "from a federal marshal back in Nebraska. He'd heard that Thorne's cousin, Riggs, was operating in my county. He wanted me to know that Elias Thorne was stripped of his badge a month ago. Seems he was using his office to settle a family grudge. Sterling, the man you killed," he said, looking at Eli, "was under federal investigation. The ring he was running, it was even bigger and uglier than you knew. They had been trying to build a case against him for a year." He looked from Eli to Clara and back again. "The way the law is written, I should arrest you. Eli, you are still wanted for murder, and I should probably arrest you, ma'am, for what happened out there today. But I have been the sheriff of this county for 20 years. I have learned that the law and justice are not always the same thing." He stood up and walked to the door. "As I see it," he said, without turning around, "a known associate of a corrupt lawman was killed while trespassing and attempting to do harm. It was a clear case of self-defense. My report will say I found him out here, likely thrown from his horse." He finally turned to look at them, a flicker of something like respect in his tired eyes. "As for you, Eli, it seems to me that justice has a funny way of finding its own level out here. You took down a man the federal government was after, and you saved a lot of girls a world of pain. I would say your debt is paid." He put his hat on. "My advice to you is to stay put. Keep your head down. I do not think anyone else will come looking for you." And with that, he turned and left, leaving them in the ruins of their home, with the gift of an impossible, unbelievable second chance. Months passed as the snows receded, the land healing itself from the harshness of winter. The mud of the thaw gave way to the soft, green shoots of spring, and just as the land healed, so did they. Together, they rebuilt. They patched the bullet holes in the walls of the cabin, each patch a scar from the battle they had won. Eli, his shoulder healing properly this time, began to build the new barn, its strong pine frame rising against the blue sky, a testament to their faith in the future. Clara planted the seeds they had saved, and soon tender green shoots of corn and beans pushed their way through the dark, rich earth. On a sunny afternoon, they walked to the willow tree, and together they planted wildflowers all around the small, stone-marked grave, covering the sad, lonely mound with a blanket of blue and yellow and white. The townsfolk in Redemption remained wary. The story the sheriff told, of a bounty hunter getting thrown from his horse, was thin, and whispers followed Clara whenever she rode in for supplies. They still saw the cursed bride, but now they also saw the tall, quiet man who was always with her, the man who loaded her wagon and touched the small of her back with a gentle, protective hand. A few of the townspeople began to soften. The blacksmith, a stern man named Jedediah, gave a curt nod to Eli one day. The woman who ran the general store, Martha, slipped an extra apple into Clara's sack of flour and offered a small, hesitant smile. They did not understand, but they saw that the haunted look in Clara's eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady light. One warm evening, as the sun was setting, painting the hills in hues of orange and gold, Eli was sitting on the porch of the nearly finished barn, watching the sky. He saw Clara come out of the cabin, carrying something in her arms. She walked to the clothesline she had strung between two trees and began to hang it up. It was a dress, a wedding dress. It was old and battered, the lace torn in several places, the hem stained with the mud of a long-ago journey. But she had mended the tears with careful, loving stitches, and she had washed it until it was a soft, forgiving white. It was the dress she was supposed to have worn for Jacob Fuller, a symbol of all her past shame and heartbreak. And now, she was hanging it out to dry in the evening sun, not erasing the past, but cleansing it, reclaiming it, making it part of her new story. Eli stood up and walked to her, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He came up behind her as she was smoothing the wrinkles from the old fabric, and he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze on the mended dress, a testament to everything they had survived. She leaned back into him, her hand covering his. They stood there for a long time, watching the last of the sun's light fade, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He tightened his arms around her and leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. "This still ain't right," he whispered, the words a familiar, beloved refrain. She felt a smile spread across her face as he finished the thought, his voice a low, happy rumble against her back. "It's better." Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.